I'm talking to Justin Cook. He is the Director of Learning for Edvance Christian Schools in Toronto, Canada. But I've got to tell you, this is one of my favorite interviews in talking about how do we bring people back to the workplace and do it in a way that helps them feel safe and connected. These skills around social and emotional literacy, social emotional health, have been developed for young kids because of their vulnerability. And I think you're going to find an amazing application and parallel to what we're going to experience bringing people back who are emotionally traumatized, chronic stress, self-regulation has been weakened, and our managers are going to be facing this. So let's move into the interview with Justin.
So the structure, the school is committed to thinking about social emotional rhythms in the midst of the academic rhythm as built in seamlessly with the academic rhythms of every day, right? And so there's a key focus on what does the body need social emotionally as the day progresses, as we're in this institutional setting in this building with, you know, a classrooms full of 30 even, but the whole school of 400 to 500. And so the key rhythms, I think, are they open the day social emotionally. So every student is welcomed and greeted and known, but then also empowered to know their classmates as well. So they're strengthening the bonds student to student and not just student to teacher. So in the primary grades, that's a circle where every child greets each other by name in some format. They share together, so they share some aspect of their lives together. It might be a prompt from the teacher that every student reacts to or responds to in small groups or large group. They do a kind of an energizing activity, some way of building community and joy together. And then the teacher offers some kind of message that transitions from the social emotional greeting and meeting of the morning into the rest of the day. I'm excited, I'm carrying this sense of connection into what we're going to start doing together now academically. In the upper grades, because developmentally it's more appropriate, that structure still happens, but it happens in groups of 4 or 5 kids together. So instead of the teacher hovering around every child, these adolescents have a bit more autonomy, a bit more independence to talk candidly with each other. But of course, the teacher is constantly monitoring whether the dialogues are healthy, there's interaction amongst different groups. But that small group of 4 or 5 becomes a crew, to use an EL education term, an advisory group where the kids develop a sense of connection in that small, more intimate setting without an adult hovering. But the adult is certainly facilitating. So a morning meeting in the primary and a responsive advisory meeting is what they call it in the upper grades. So, and that's all from Responsive Classroom. So we've done a lot of learning with an organization called the Center for Responsive Schools, and we've done extensive training with Halton Hills, but other schools through their work. Just a couple other quick rhythms on the day, Rex. That after second nutritional break, the kids are, you know, halfway through or even 2/3 of the way through a busy day, tons of, you know, extroversion and social interaction, especially on the playground, right, where it's highly unstructured but highly active. So that transition back into the classroom, we know the brain requires time if it's going to make abrupt transitions, that it's unfair to expect a brain to go from 110 miles an hour to 20 miles an hour in the span of minutes. So that there's a quiet time built in, 10 to 15 minutes of again, just really individual autonomous time where kids are expected to do what they want to do to make a transition back into the classroom. As long as they're not bothering their classmates, the time is really theirs. Read, head down, listen to music, doodle. It's really, it's agency for the student to kind of make a choice that feels healthy and helps transition back into the classroom. And of course, especially for those more introverted, it's a pivotal recharge time because they've just been completely drained with
Yeah.
all the social activity in the outside time. And our schools, Halton Hills included, would say if anyone's concerned about losing time academically, they feel like that 10 minutes gains them so much more time in terms of focus and productivity. So there's just, schools are thinking about increasing quiet time because it's leading to productivity, not taking away. So
Yeah.
pretty excited about that. And then the last rhythm of the day is a closing circle. So instead of frantically trying to give homework and send kids out, throwing backpacks on and this kind of frenzied close to the day where the teacher's frantically trying to finish what didn't get done, we make sure there's 20 minutes at the end of the day where we again circle up. And I would say this is true for both the primary and the upper grades. And we just offer the kids some kind of reflective close, some way of closing the day reflectively where we can make explicit whatever might be implicit from the day. And the teacher might offer a prompt that's, lament, like some kind of what was hard today, but it might be celebration, what went well today. It could be, increasing social emotional literacy, like how did your bucket get filled in a moment today? Or what was one moment where a classmate really helped you today? So just, again, trying to put a bit of a bookend on the franticness of the day, the busyness of the day, send kids away from the institution, from the organization with that sense of organization that, yeah, I reflected on what happened. I'm in control of what happened. I understand what happened. And I feel like I was honored as I left in my activity. So that closing circle is pretty significant as well in terms of metacognition and reflection.
Have you applied any of these practices to your leadership team? And if so, what have you done? And I know most of your team is distributed, which is an interesting parallel to the remote work everybody's doing.
Right.
So what have you found that you're using?
Yeah. So on a simple level, I won't start a meeting without some kind of way of acknowledging where people are at coming into the meeting. So there'll be some kind of check-in that allows us to acknowledge just our basic humanness before we actually get to the task at hand. So it might be, and so the check-in is almost always something kind of, safely personal, or just invites people to kind of give a sense of awareness to the group about where they're at or what they're feeling. So it could be something positive that's happened for you in the last week, or something that you're struggling with, again, or both, right? Inviting people to say, hey, I'm coming in from a good space and here's why, or I'm coming into this space with some frustration and grief and here's why. And again, it allows everybody in the meeting to be seen, to be focused on, to be acknowledged. So it might be as simple a rhythm, and this feels maybe a little bit elementary, but if you, me, and 10 others are in a meeting, you might start by saying, good morning, team. And the entire team would say, good morning, Rex, kind of just as a call and response. That kind of, we know your name. We're glad you're in the circle with us in this meeting. We want to hear from you while you're here in this meeting, that kind of focus. And then I think maybe, and this ties in, I could talk about this within the classroom too, but we work hard to be really explicit about what kind of norms we can expect from each other within any space of collaboration. So what are the drivers that are going to make our collaborative time or our work time meaningful and safe and directed? It could be as simple as we're going to make sure the agenda gets in people's hands at least 48 hours before a meeting, to we're going to practice active listening responses so that we reiterate what we hear before we respond. It could be all kinds of ways of just making really explicit social emotional structures for our time together as adults in terms of workflow and collaboration.
So now consider you've just been hired by, major utility company or some corporation in Toronto that wants you to come in and advise them
Mm.
that they say, we've got 1,000 employees that are going to be returning. We need your help to help us think through questions we need to be asking ourselves and a framework for this transition.
Mhm.
Where would you start?
I think one of the most significant ways of responding to trauma, and I want to be cautious here because I am not a psychologist, right, Rex? I
No,
don't have that
right.
degree. One of the most dynamic ways I think of responding to trauma, and this has to be done, and maybe trauma is almost too strong, although I appreciate the way you're talking about this as a wartime measure that we're in right now. But I appreciate the thought that suffering can lead to growth as long as we can organize it into some kind of meaningful narrative, right? So if I can actually contextualize suffering into some kind of ongoing story that has a sense of direction, then I am transforming suffering into something positive that I can actually build on, as opposed to it gets stuck in my implicit, fight, flight response, amygdala response, reptilian brain,
Right.
and I can't even control what that suffering is doing to me, let alone how it's channeling to other people through me, right?
Yeah.
So one of the key things I think with that company, they need to help those employees reflect on what the heck has happened. How are you feeling about what's happened? How has it impacted you? So we use this in conflict situations. This is a restorative practice question script. What happened? What were you thinking at the time? What are you thinking about now? What do you think should happen next? A really simple open-ended script that actually is about narrative creation. It's about what is the story at play here. You have the voice to talk about what specifically you think the narrative is here and where you think it needs to go next. So we talk about that when in a harm relationship. So if I punched you in the face in a playground event, both of us have a chance to tell the story of how that came to be, right?
Right.
And by understanding the deeper narrative of what's at play there, our long-term history, for instance, it's not just an isolated event. What came before that? We can organize that event into a much more purposeful, understandable, and hopeful narrative moving forward.
It's interesting. So I've been working with my clients using the framework of Kubler-Ross and asking them, and if you think of grief really in terms of it's just loss, loss of familiarity, loss of competency, loss, it's loss, something you feel loss over. And I try to ask where they think they are in that. And some of them, realize and see it's clearer to the outside person than it is to the inside person as to where they might be stuck. And I'm aligning it with the hero's journey. That, the hero gets hit by circumstances and doesn't see the bigger implication. They go through denial, then they get upset or angry or frustrated at the inconvenience or the problem. Then they try to buffer and get the best of both worlds. I want to stay here, or, I'm going to be forced to change. Then they go into that deep pit of despair of losing, vertigo. I have no idea where this is going, whether I'm going to come out of this. And then they get to a certain point where it's finished in them. They've cut their emotional tie to the past. They're clear. And then they begin to see the new adventure. It's the red pill, blue pill.
Right.
And I got to tell you how uncanny it is in talking to coaching my clients. They're at some phase, and I see my role as helping them process through as much as possible, because if they take that loss with them into their people, they really can't be genuine leaders to that new other side. How do we get to the other side? They're still trying to hold on. How does that play in, and how is that similar to what you see going on in this, restorative justice, or this helping people create that narrative.
Yeah.
And maybe
Well,
it's
one
just
thing I think,
another way to create a narrative.
yeah. Well, what I like about the way it creates a narrative, and this is something we're intentionally focused on at Advance as an association, is, you know, we talk often about the fact that we want to put the principal, the leader, or the teacher in the heroic position, right? So it's
Right.
the same stuff you helped us with at Hamilton when we think about the role of the guide, right?
Right.
And but we desperately want to support schools to be putting the students in the heroic position. That's what we think makes schools incredibly healthy, right? Where they're creating narrative experiences for their kids, where the kids feel like they have epic lives and journeys to live, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what's implicit, I think, in the way you're describing this is by framing the story as a journey, a hero's journey, you're immediately assuming, full stop, that the protagonist of that story, whether it's the client or, you know, that worker that you asked me to imagine coming back into the workflow, that they're capable of heroism. You know, that the story they're living is significant and can
Yeah.
contribute something really significant to the community that they're a part of, right? So that's been very dynamic for us. We're, you know, in the midst of crisis management, trauma management through the COVID shutdown, people are raving about my organization because they desperately need a guide, right? They are desperate for someone to come alongside them. And we're already perfectly primed with our brand script and the way that we want to relate to our schools to see it that way. We're not trying to take over their narratives. We're just trying to offer them input and guidance as they think about managing the pit that you're describing, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's one point that comes to mind. It seems simple, but the fact that you're framing it as a heroic journey is not, that is highly, highly relevant to the way that someone understands their story, right?
Right. Yep.
And then I wonder too if, you know, we've been, as we think about navigating the COVID shutdown, we've been talking about 3 phases. So the first phase was a sprint. All of a sudden, we got dropped as bombshell by government that we couldn't go to our schools. And we scrambled to ideate and create a plan, right? So do something. We have to do something. And for me, that was frantically writing a script email for schools to then send out to their parents. Here's what you need to say right away, right? So, but that sprint was exhausting, right? Like we're on a full-on sprint. Everybody lost their March break. We're scrambling in a sprint to come up with a plan. That's phase 1. Phase 2, we've just come off this sprint, but now we're realizing this is not a 5-day shutdown, it's a months-long shutdown. And now we realize we got to adapt a plan that was thrown together. We got to stabilize what the experience is for a diverse set of families in our community, but we're already exhausted from phase 1. So now we're completely empty social emotionally. We're taking this exhaustion into trying to find ways to actually make the plan workable. But as we're in phase 2, we're telling our schools that phase 3 is on the horizon, and phase 3 is stable, it's sustainable, and you can even flourish and thrive in the midst of this complexity because of the hard work you're doing in phase 1 and phase 2. So what that does is it frames the story. Look, you feel exhausted and completely blindsided right now. You lost your holiday time. But phase 3 is on the horizon. So let's do the hard work here. We're going to find ways to do it together. And we're going to get to that phase 3 where we actually feel like I'm not only okay, I feel more resilient than ever because of my experience in phase 1 and phase 2.
Well, yeah, there's a little bit of that, what you call that battle toughness. Once you survive that first assault, you do get a second wind. Now, where are you guys in thinking about, okay, things won't be normal. So what are you imagining the new normal to look like?
Yeah, great question. So these what ifs come to mind for me.
Yeah.
We're urging schools to be honest about how much the compliance environment of grade acquisition was driving the student-teacher relationship, and how, like, this one thing that I think is incredible, Rex, is we're trying, and with government permission, to take the grade and measurement conversation off the table.
It's happening here in the States too.
So then what's left? Does the teacher actually have something else to build on in her relationship with her students through the online environment, right?
Right.
If you're not able to talk about grades because that's not valid anymore, how can we see the gathering of information as a relational gift, that you come alongside the kids, you ask them how they're doing, you offer them some structure by which they can continue to learn meaningful things, even though you're separate and you're in a virtual environment.
Right.
We're asking schools to do a full audit of what remained when the grade part of the relationship was taken off the table. And be honest about that. If very little remained, then we realize we got a lot of work to do to create a much deeper, richer relationship with kids than just grade acquisition. But if there was a lot to draw on, if we had a lot of relationship there, celebrate that and keep building on that aspect of the relationship moving forward.
Nice.
So taking grade measurement off the relational dynamic is one hopeful gift that we're taking away from this. But I got a couple others, but you wanted to jump in.
No. Those are good. Keep going with that. And just as an FYI, I'm going to have to disconnect at 1:45 because I've got another webinar coming up. But
yeah.
This is all rich information, and I think totally transportable into the work environment.
Yeah, cool. So another one, two others I think that come to mind. This is especially true in elementary, but it's pretty cool for us to acknowledge and then try and build on as a strength, the fact that all of a sudden other authority figures in the students' lives, namely their parents, are plopped directly into the classroom.
Wow.
So now if the dining room table's the classroom, there's the parents sitting right there. And that vulnerability of the teacher to actually be on display with the full family in the room I think is a rich opportunity for us to strengthen the community relationships and the social capital we have around the kid, right? So how can we maximize the learning we have in this time to keep thinking about that parent being virtually beside the kid in the learning story? And then second of all, connected to that, how do we continue to think about the school not as a fortress, but as a base camp out of which learning excursions are constantly happening, as opposed to this fortress where we get the kids in the building at 9 a.m. or 8:30 every day, and we keep them in there until 3:30 every day, and the learning starts and stops only when they're in the building, right? As opposed to the breakdown of that fortress mentality where, yeah, kids are learning constantly. How do we think about bringing that learning into the base camp of the school, intentionally designing expeditions or excursions out of the school, whether that be into the home or into the community, and this is where the project-based learning approach sets us up well. Let's just recognize that the kid's life is much more nuanced and rich and multi-layered than just the 6 hours or whatever it is that they're inside the fortress of a school.
Wow. Yeah. Now, are you looking at changes in the interior setup of the school and the classrooms to, do you see that as part of it? Or do you see that, the classes that we saw are highly interactive and kids are, nobody's 6 feet apart. Of course, schools in general, you're not, but the social emotional side of the equation, how do you maintain that in a 6-foot radius world?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's complex. I think one of the ways we might be able to do it is to try to combine those last two comments by maybe even going to a day 1, day 2 structure where half the school is out learning in home or in community, and the other half of the school is in the building on that day. And we have time, we have space, first of all, to be a little bit more physically distant, but we have, because we're minimizing the group to half, we have a different relational dynamic, a much more intimate relational dynamic at play because the numbers are so much lower. So yeah, you're more spread out physically, But because there's not so many kids buzzing around everywhere, 30 kids in the group, maybe it's only 15, and you're on this day one, day two structure, you can really create a bit more intimacy in the dialogue and the conversation because you're only having it with half the group.
Yeah, and that's going to be a puzzle for everybody. How do we figure this
Right.
this rhythm, not, maintaining the right rhythm, learning rhythm, work rhythm, and still the physical distancing.
Right.
And I think that there's another parallel too, is that some schools transition to remote learning easily. Some, it was probably not smooth and highly disruptive. And so that's going to create questions. The ones where it wasn't smooth or highly disruptive, parents sending kids back to those schools, um, how is that playing out in terms of how ready the schools were for this, and what maybe the implications might be in the fall?
Yeah, I wonder if the same thing has to happen like we talked about in that, 1,000-person workforce in Toronto, where parents and kids and teachers have to be given that opportunity to kind of frame the confusion of the experience into what the heck happened, and
Yeah,
if we can create a way for there to be reflection on that in a non-judgmental environment where
I like that.
someone, person A says, I'm really impressed with myself. I never knew I was so adaptive and improvisational that I was willing to lean into conflict and crisis so well. And person B, who's like, I don't even want to talk about it because I hated myself through it, that both of those people have an opportunity to actively and honestly reflect and say,
Hmm.
I impressed myself or I hated myself, and both of those responses are okay. Let's think about incorporating that into the reflection and the dialogue. Um, I don't know if you're following this, but the women's shelters are completely jam-packed right now because the domestic violence in the home is through the roof, right? And
Really?
yeah, I think if
Yeah.
if
That,
the home environment was dysfunctional,
yeah, it just magnifies it.
yeah, think about the prison that especially women, I think,
Yeah,
are forced to live in, and children for that matter, are
yeah,
forced to
right,
live in right
right.
now. So the trauma is not only what happened externally by being forced home. For some people, the trauma is an amplified internal home environment that's violent, or that's emotionally violent even.
Yeah.
So there's that layer, I think, of trying to
Wow.
incorporate the story, understand what the heck happened, not only externally but internally.
So the last question would be, if you were tasked to pull together uh, some experts and resources to begin helping corporate America
Mm.
and corporate Canada and, well, corporate North America uh, prepare to bring people back, two questions. Who would you bring to the table? How much time, we've got, maybe 60 to 90 days before companies really begin this process in large scale. Who would you bring to the table? How much time would it take to be able to help managers and corporate leadership fully appreciate and adjust and adapt to this migration that's coming?
I wonder, my immediate thought, we're talking about, so we have a professional development calendar, a professional learning calendar that got completely tsunamied, right? Like we had to
Right.
completely take everything off, and we don't even know whether our fall events are going to happen. So what we're attempting to do is, in the vacuum that's created with that professional development calendar being wiped clean, can we treat that almost like a Sabbath, right? So is it possible that the time that is afforded, because now we're not sending people to these learning events to fill them with new information, in the vacuum that's created with our calendars being swept clean, can we create structures of reflection and interpretation so that time, that 60 to 90 days you're talking about, all the things that got taken out of those 60 to 90 days of expectations for development, maybe we use that time to say, okay, we're going to process where we're at, what happened,
Oh, yeah.
work on it from that perspective. To me, facilitators who understand narrative, Rex, are the ones who I think create meaning in the midst of suffering. And so that, for me, I lean on my restorative practice training as a facilitator to think about helping someone else answer open-ended question that organize the experience for purpose or for clarity.
Good.
You did the same thing, right? So who can ask the right questions that frame what feels completely disjointed and crisis and complex, to frame all those random events and emotions into something coherent and story-like?
Wow.
That to me is the person I want to lean on. And teachers, that's what teachers should do. They shouldn't transmit content. They should organize life for purpose and narrative. That's what I think they need to do as well.
And I think managers too, if you do.